Hi, my name is Julia Joes, and I will be presenting the key contributions for our website, Encroachment and Resistance. For many people, the encroachment on Mexico and Mexican people started with the Mexican-American War, which ended in the Treaty de Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was where the U.S. had bought from Mexico after the war California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and parts of Colorado for $15 million. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo also claimed to ensure that the people who remained on where they had lived, that is now U.S. territory, would be able to keep their land and would be granted U.S. citizenship. Although, as time went on, people realized that they weren't getting the rights that they were promised and were starting to act in resistance. And this is where a lot of our leaders of resistance that we see today have emerged. After the Treaty de Guadalupe Hidalgo, for example, money and land were being taken from the Mexican population, making wealthy Mexican farmers and wealthy Mexican people and putting them at the bottom of the economic ladder. This economic gap still persists to this day as of generational wealth. One of the leaders of resistance that we see was Emma B. Tenayuca, and she was most prominent in the 1930s. She was active in protest for civil rights, was an educator and an organizer, and general secretary for several workers' alliance organizations. In 1938, Tenayuca contacted the San Antonio Pecan Shellers, who was one of the most prominent organizations and companies at that time in Texas. She led a 37-day walkout protesting low pay and working conditions. After their protest for 37 days, on October 24, 1938, the Fair Labor Relations Act was passed, which raised the minimum wage to 25 cents per hour, which their previous pay was around 10 cents per hour. She was a big part in creating inspiration and confidence in her community and led multiple other protests as well. After this, the Bracero program during World War II was a big part on encroaching on the Mexican population's rights in the U.S. The Bracero program was an agreement between Mexico and the U.S. during the Second World War due to executive order from U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It was put in motion in 1942. It was intended to bring people from Mexico to the U.S. on short-term seasonal labor plans to work in the labor sectors to keep it afloat during the war. After the war, it was renewed, and Mexican laborers were restricted to working in only agricultural labor. It was then abolished in 1964, and while it was active, more than 4 million people came from Mexico to the U.S. Although this was helpful for the Mexican population and Mexican migrant workers as they were faced with poverty in Mexico, they were unaware of the U.S. labor practices and were easily exploited, making them more sought after than the U.S. white American workers. This is one of the possible origins of the poor immigration sentiment in the U.S. The National Farm Workers Association emerged from the Bracero program as a sort of union and protest group of farm workers that were being exploited. And this really gained rise in the 60s as their co-founders Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta established it in 1962. They gained most traction during the Delano grape strike, which was where the association and over 800 Filipino laborers adjacently striked companies to Shenley, and this is where they boycotted companies that sold products of Shenley, which was the major grape picking organization and grape processing organization of the time. This led to their first negotiation, which made higher wages, and they continued to boycott to advocate to the workers to have the right to freely unionize and bargain with their employers. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huertas were both people who were born around 1930s, during the Great Depression and moved to California when they were young. Cesar Chavez was in the U.S. military, and when he came back to California, pursued his love of activism. He joined the Community Services Organization, also known as the CSO, where he meets Dolores Huertas and goes on to found the NFWA in 1962. He was active in other protests and eventually received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Dolores Huertas also moved to California as a child and went to college in California, became a mother, and then a teacher. Although as a teacher, she decided she wanted to help the children she taught for in a different way through protest and activism. She joined the CSO, met Cesar Chavez, and they both founded the NFWA, who was also part of the United Farm Workers radio station and got the Presidential Medal of Freedom, as well as it being included in the National Women's Hall of Fame. Adjacent to this was the Royal Chicano Air Force, which was an independent arts sector of the National Farm Workers Association, particularly based in Sacramento. They were famous for their work in murals, posters, and community engagement. Their main goal was to express and celebrate the indigenous and Chicano culture, which had usually been shamed at the time. They were trying to remove the shame associated. They were originally named the Rebel Chicano Air Front, but were confused with the Rebel Canadian Air Force, therefore changing their name. They were also known as being bodyguards for Cesar Chavez during his protests. Tony Gonzalez is another form of artistic resilience in Sacramento, as lowriding proved to be a crucial art form for the youth at the time. The lowriding movement was large in Sacramento during the 1970s and 80s. Tony Gonzalez was born and raised in Sacramento and grew up going to the Washington Neighborhood Center. His passion then led him to be part of their board of directors. He created an outreach program called the Sacramento Lowriding Association, which reached out to struggling Chicano teenagers and students who had been pushed away by their schools because of their criminalization. He then helped them gain skills in community work, creating art, organization planning, and activism. He helped make their community more active and engaging. Thank you. This is my works cited.